The dog hit the door before anyone else could move. Not the soldiers, not the orderlies who'd sprinted alongside the gurney from the helipad, not the attending physician who'd been paged 4 minutes ago and arrived, breathless, at the threshold of Trauma Bay 2. The Belgian Malinois, mottled tan and black, chest heaving, a vest still strapped across his ribs with the word K9 stenciled in reflective letters, planted himself between the incoming stretcher and every other living thing in that hallway and showed his teeth. Nobody came closer. The man on the gurney had a GSW to the left flank, possible pneumothorax, BP dropping. The corpsman who'd ridden with him from the LZ was still pressing a wad of gauze against the entry wound with both hands, talking quietly, not to the medical staff waiting at the bay door, but to the dog. "Easy, Bravo, easy. We're good, we're good." Bravo didn't look like he believed it. Joanna Selle had been mid-shift when the call came through. 11 hours in, 2 patients transferred, one family she'd had to walk to the quiet room at the end of the hallway. She was refilling her coffee when the radio crackled. Medevac inbound, Ranger, critical, and she'd moved on autopilot, the mug still in her hand when she reached the bay. She set it on the windowsill. She watched the dog. Bravo was still blocking the gurney's path, though his handler, a stocky man in dusty ACUs who jogged in from the side entrance, was now crouching 3 feet away, hand extended, palm down, saying the dog's name in a low, even register. The Malinois kept glancing at the man on the stretcher. Every time someone in scrubs stepped forward, the dog's head swung around and the growl returned, low and constant, like an engine idling. Dr. Perkins, the attending, said something sharp about needing to move, now, and one of the trauma nurses, a big guy named Hutchins who'd done 2 years at Walter Reed, reached for the gurney rail, and Bravo lunged forward 2 steps, and Hutchins stepped back fast enough that he knocked over the supply cart behind him. Trays clattered. Someone swore. The ranger on the gurney didn't move. Joanna walked forward. She didn't do it because she had a plan. She did it because everyone else had stopped and someone had to, and she was the one with nothing in her hands. She approached from the side, not the front, and she didn't look at Bravo directly. She kept her eyes down and slightly to the left, the way you do with a dog that's scared and trying to hold it together, and she stopped about 4 feet out and just stood there. The growling didn't stop, but it changed pitch, slightly. "It's okay," she said, not to the dog exactly, to the room. "To the situation, he's going to be okay." Bravo watched her. His ears, which had been pinned flat, shifted forward a degree. She took 1 step closer, then another. She crouched slowly until she was below the dog's eye level, and she held out the back of her hand, not reaching toward him, just offering, and waited. The handler behind her exhaled. Bravo sniffed the air. Then he stepped forward and pressed his nose to her knuckles, and the growl stopped. "Go ahead," Joanna said, and the team moved. His name was Sergeant First Class Derek Oman, and he'd been in country for 7 months when his patrol walked into something they weren't supposed to find. That was the version the man in the gray suit gave her. Anyway, standing in the hallway outside the ICU at 6 in the morning when she came back on shift and found him there. He had a federal ID she didn't recognize the agency of, and a name, Aldrich, that she suspected wasn't his. "He's stable," she told him, because that was all she was allowed to tell anyone who wasn't on the approved contact list, and Aldrich wasn't on anything. "I know he's stable," Aldrich said. "I just need to know about the dog." She looked at him. "The handler took Bravo home last night," she said. "You'd have to ask Sergeant Pryor about that. Pryor's been reassigned." Aldrich tucked his ID back into his jacket. "Effective this morning." Joanna thought about that for a moment. She thought about the way Bravo had watched Derek Oman's chest rise and fall all night, through the ICU window, the handler sitting on the floor in the hallway, because nobody had the heart to make him leave. She thought about how at 3 in the morning, when she'd gone to do vitals, the dog had lifted his head from his paws and watched her move around the bed with something that didn't look like suspicion anymore. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" she said. "Or are you just here to make the morning strange?" Aldrich almost smiled. "Sergeant Oman is going to have visitors today, people who are authorized to be here. I'd like you to pay attention to anyone who doesn't follow standard protocol, anyone who seems too interested. Everyone who walks into an ICU is interested," she said. "That's generally why they're here." "You know what I mean." She did. She just wanted him to say it plainly, and he wouldn't, and that told her something too. The first visitor came at 9. A woman in her 50s, silver hair, wearing the kind of business casual that said she'd come from an office rather than a flight. She signed in at the desk with a name Joanna checked against the list. Margaret Oman, sister. It matched. She sat beside the bed for 40 minutes, held Derek's hand, cried quietly, left without asking anyone anything unusual. The second visitor came at noon. He said he was a colleague, gave a name that also matched the list. Ryan Cassidy, same unit, but he was wrong about which side Derek's injury was on. Asked about the left shoulder when the wound was in the flank. He could have misspoken. People misspoke when they were scared. Joanna made a note. The third one came at 2:15, and he didn't come from the hallway. She noticed it because she was charting at the station across from Derek's room, and she happened to look up at exactly the right moment. The door to his room was open, the way she'd left it. The window blinds were angled the way she'd left them. But the figure inside, male, scrubs that were the right color but the wrong cut, was standing at the IV stand rather than at the bedside, and he was doing something with his hands that had nothing to do with checking a line. Joanna was moving before she'd consciously decided to. She pushed through the door and said, "Excuse me," in the voice she used for people who needed to understand that she wasn't asking a question, and the man turned around. He was young, mid-20s maybe, and the look on his face when he saw her was not the look of someone caught doing something innocent. "I was just—" "Step away from the IV," she said. He did. She stepped between him and the stand and kept her eyes on him while she checked the line with her free hand. The port on the secondary access had been disturbed. She couldn't tell yet if anything had been introduced. "I'd," she said. He ran. Not immediately. For a half-second he held very still, the way people do when they're calculating, and then he went for the door on her left, the one that led to the service corridor, and she hit the emergency call button on the wall beside the bed at the same moment, and the alarm started, and he was gone before anyone arrived. But Derek Oman was still breathing, and Joanna was still standing between him and the door when the security team got there. They interviewed her for 2 hours. Not hospital security, actual agents, 2 of them, one of whom had the quiet, slightly too calm manner of someone who'd done this kind of interview many times and considered it a professional art form. She answered everything they asked. She asked, in return, whether someone was going to check the IV port, and they said yes, and she said she'd like to know the results, and the calmer agent said that wasn't her purview, and she said she understood that, but she was asking anyway. She didn't get a direct answer. She hadn't expected one. What she got instead was Aldrich again. He came to find her at shift change when she was in the break room eating a granola bar she'd been carrying in her pocket since morning. He sat down across from her without asking if she minded. "You didn't freeze," he said. Freezing didn't seem useful. A lot of people would have. She didn't say anything to that. She was thinking about the IV port and about the man's face when he'd turned around and about the fact that nobody had been able to tell her yet whether Derek Oman was still safe. "He's been moved," Aldrich said, as if he'd heard the question she hadn't asked. "Different room. Additional measures." "Bravo," she said. Aldrich looked at her. "Bring the dog back," she said. "I know there's a protocol issue. I know it's not standard, but whatever those measures are, add the dog. He won't let anyone get close who shouldn't be close." "That's not a feeling. I watched him do it." Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "The handler's been reassigned. Bravo doesn't need the handler to do this. He needs." She stopped. She looked at her granola bar. "He needs someone the dog has already cleared." The silence in the break room was specific, the kind that meant something was being decided. "You served," Aldrich said. It wasn't a question. She looked up at him. "My brother did. 2 tours. He had a partner dog the last 18 months. I know how they work. That's not the same as—" "I know it's not the same." Her voice was even. "I'm not asking to run the operation. I'm asking you to bring the dog to the room where your asset is currently vulnerable and let the dog do what he was trained to do." She set the granola bar down. "The man who came into that room today knew which IV port to go for. He had maybe 90 seconds before I came through that door. That's not random. Someone told him exactly where to go and what to do, which means someone in this hospital is carrying information out." Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression that wasn't quite respect, but was adjacent to it. "I'll see what I can do," he said. Bravo arrived at 7 the next morning. Not with Pryor, with a woman Joanna didn't recognize, short and efficient looking, who handed her a card that said nothing useful and said the dog was to remain in the room unless Joanna or the attending specifically requested otherwise. She looked at Joanna when she said Joanna's name, which meant she knew exactly who Joanna was, and had probably known before she walked in. Bravo went straight to the room, straight to the bed. He sniffed Derek Oman's hand, which was lying open on the blanket, and then he curled up on the floor beside the bed and put his head on his paws and waited. Derek had been drifting in and out. He wasn't fully conscious, wasn't fully gone. He'd said a few words the night before, his own name, something that might have been a city, something that sounded like a question nobody in the room could parse. But when Bravo settled on the floor beside him, his hand moved. Not much, just his fingers curling slightly, the way they might if he'd felt something familiar. Joanna watched that from the doorway and felt something loosen in her chest. She went and did the rest of her rounds. He opened his eyes on the third day. Not all the way, not clearly, but enough. Joanna was in the room charting when it happened. Bravo's head came up first. The dog was faster than any monitor, and then Derek Oman blinked, slowly, and turned his head a degree and looked at the ceiling. "Sergeant Oman," she said, keeping her voice low and even, "you're at Landstuhl. You were Medivist in 3 days ago. You're stable." He blinked again. His lips moved. "Take your time," she said. He took a breath. It sounded wrong, carefully managed, the kind that meant he was working at it, and then he said quietly, "Bravo." The dog was already standing. He put his chin on the edge of the bed, next to Derek's hand, and Derek turned his palm and rested it on the top of Bravo's head without looking. His eyes were still on the ceiling. "Good," he said, to the dog, to the room, to whatever accounting he was doing. "Okay." Joanna gave them a minute. She checked the monitors. She wrote down numbers she already knew by memory. Then she said, "Someone tried to access your IV line 2 days ago. I stopped them. Do you have any idea who would know enough to try something like that?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might have slipped back under. Then he said, "Cassidy." She thought about the man at noon, the one who'd gotten the injury wrong. "He came here," she said. Derek's jaw tightened. "He's not." He stopped, started again. "He crossed 6 months ago. We didn't." He exhaled. "How close?" "He didn't get anything into the line." He closed his eyes. "You were faster." Bravo bought time, she said. "He wouldn't let the team in for the first few minutes, long enough for me to clear the room." A sound came out of Derek Oman that was almost a laugh. "He does that." "I know," she said. "I had a friend who ran them. I know how they work." He was quiet again. Then, without opening his eyes, "What's your name?" Said, "Joanna Selle. You the one who stayed with him?" She didn't ask how he knew. She didn't ask what he'd been aware of, unconscious and wired to monitors, in the 3 days since he'd come in. She just said yes. He turned his head then, for the first time, and looked at her. He was pale beneath the tan, and there were deep lines at the corners of his eyes that had nothing to do with age. He looked like someone who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and hadn't set it down yet. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once. She finished her charting. She straightened the monitor lead that had been slightly crooked since the night shift and noted the time in the log and told him she'd be back in 2 hours. At the door she paused. Bravo had gone back to the floor. His head was on his paws again, but his eyes were open, tracking the door, tracking her. She looked at him for a moment. "Good boy," she said quietly. His tail moved once against the floor. Then he settled and watched the door and didn't look away. The man who'd come through the service corridor was found in Frankfurt 3 days later. Aldrich told her this in the same hallway outside the ICU, the same 6 a.m. light coming through the window at the end of the corridor. He said it the way people say things that are resolved but not clean, satisfied and tired at the same time. "Cassidy?" she asked. "Being handled." She didn't ask what that meant. There were entire vocabularies in this world she didn't speak and didn't need to. "Omen's being transferred," Aldrich said. "Stateside. Bethesda, probably, then home care. Bravo goes with him." She looked down the hall. Through the window in Derek's doors, she could see the shape of the dog on the floor, a dark form at the foot of the bed, absolutely still. "He's good at what he does," she said. "So are you," Aldrich said. She looked at him. He shrugged. It was the most human gesture she'd seen him make. "You slowed everything down and bought enough time for the alert to reach us. You identified Cassidy from a behavioral tell we missed on our own review, and you called for the dog when everyone else was focused on standard protocol." He paused. "We have a unit. Not military, not exactly. People who know how hospitals work, how facilities work, how to see things that don't belong. He looked at her steadily. Your name came up. Joanna thought about her 11-hour shifts. She thought about the quiet room at the end of the hallway and the families she walked into it. She thought about the granola bar she'd been carrying since morning that day. She thought about the way Bravo had tilted his head the first time he'd looked at her, like he was deciding something. Like he was doing his own kind of assessment. I'll think about it, she said. Aldrich nodded. He didn't push. That, too, told her something. She went back into Derek's room to do his final pre-transfer assessment. He was more alert today, sitting up slightly, irritated by the monitor leads the way patients always got when they started feeling better. Bravo was on his feet, pacing the perimeter of the room in a slow, methodical circuit, checking the window, checking the door. He does that when there's a change coming, Derek said, watching the dog. Different location. He's recalibrating. He's good at reading situations, she said. Best I've worked with. He paused. I grew up around working dogs, she said. My brother ran them. Past tense. She looked up from the chart. Derek's eyes were steady on her, not pressing, just seeing. Ramadi, she said, 2019. He didn't say he was sorry. She appreciated that. People said it because they didn't know what else to offer, and she understood it, and it was still never what you needed. What Derek did instead was nod once, the kind of nod that meant he knew exactly what that word cost, and he wasn't going to spend it cheaply. Bravo's handler, she said after a moment. The one who was reassigned. Is he okay? Pryor. Derek almost smiled. Yeah, he's okay. He just needed to be somewhere they couldn't use him as leverage. He looked at the dog. That's how this works sometimes. You move people to protect them, and it looks like something else from the outside. She thought about Aldrich. She thought about the card the woman had handed her with nothing useful on it. Do you know what you're going to do? She asked, when you're recovered. He was quiet for a moment. Go back. She'd expected that. You? He said. She capped her pen. She looked at Bravo, who had stopped his circuit and was sitting now, directly between the door and the bed, watching her with those particular eyes, patient and serious and already decided. I don't know yet, she said. And that was honest. She didn't know. She knew that she'd walked into a room without a plan because someone had to. She knew that she'd stood between a man and something that wanted to hurt him, and she hadn't shaken until much later, in the parking structure, alone, where nobody needed anything from her. She knew that when she'd looked at that IV line and understood what someone had almost done, what she'd felt wasn't fear exactly. It was something sharper and more focused, a thing that clarified rather than froze. She knew Bravo had looked at her and made a decision in about 30 seconds. She didn't have 30 seconds worth of certainty about much, but she thought that maybe that was okay. She thought that certainty wasn't always the thing. Sometimes the thing was just moving forward when everyone else stopped, doing the next right action, standing in the gap while you figured out the rest. She wrote the last entry in the chart. She hung it back on the hook at the foot of the bed. Derek Oman would be on a transport in 4 hours. She'd be back on shift in 6. Everything would go back to the version of normal that hospitals operated on. Managed chaos, caffeine, the particular fluorescent light that gave everyone the same gray pallor by hour 8. At the door she paused. She looked at Bravo. He looked back at her. She thought about her brother. She thought about the way he used to talk about his partner dog. The way he said the dog always knew before anyone did. Before the scan came back, before the call came in, before the order got handed down. The dog just knew, and if you were paying attention to the dog, you had an extra few seconds of knowing too. She reached out and rested her hand on Bravo's head, briefly, just for a moment. His tail moved against the floor. Once, steady. Take care of him, she said. She walked out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed the way they always did. A cart rattled past. Someone on the overhead called a code that wasn't hers. The shift was starting again. She picked up her coffee from the nurse's station and drank it standing up, looking out the window at the gray morning, and thought about all the rooms in all the hospitals where something was happening that nobody was paying attention to. Thought about what it meant to be the person who paid attention. Thought about the card she'd been given and the offer Aldrich had almost but not quite made, and the fact that she had, in the end, done the one thing she never did in 11-hour shifts. She had stopped. She had crouched down. She had held out her hand and waited to see what the dog would do. And the dog had chosen her. She set her coffee down. She picked up the first chart of the day. She got to work.